There's a few studies that have looked at strictly dose response relationships. You get better the higher you go, but then at some point you plateau. And even going beyond that, there's a potential risk of negative effects on performance. Most of the time, it's a 1% benefit at best. So that matters, but it's not as big as what most companies would like you to think it is in most cases.
Patrick, you are a leading expert in sports nutrition, gastrointestinal function in athletes, and an exercise physiologist that has studied and published a lot in this area. You also wrote the book, The Athlete's Gut. So most of the substances, supplements, and strategies that we're going to discuss today kind of sit in the category of ergogenic aids. If used correctly, they have the potential to improve endurance performance, but if not, gastrointestinal distress is usually the main side effect. So let's start with carbohydrate. Based on all your research, is there an optimal carbohydrate intake per hour that optimizes endurance performance? And if there is, what is it?
Yeah, it's a good question, and honestly, sometimes a bit challenging question to answer in some respects. I think the easy answer is that some carbohydrate is going to be beneficial to most endurance athletes in most competitive settings. The sort of question around how much is a little bit more complicated, and it really does depend on the duration of the exercise, the intensity of the exercise, and then also probably the caliber of the athlete and how experienced they are. Those would be the main things that I would kind of look at to formulate some sort of guideline around carbohydrate intake. So the longer the exercise goes, maybe the higher the amounts can be pushed. And part of that is tolerance. You know, the longer the exercise goes, naturally the percentage of, let's say, max, effort or VO2 max percent is going to be lower. You're typically able to handle a little bit more carbohydrate at lower percentages of your VO2 max, especially if you're not accustomed to doing it. Now, a marathoner, like an elite marathoner, may be running at 90% of their VO2 max for the whole race. So that's obviously very intense for them, not the average recreational runner. So it's kind of this interaction between duration, intensity, caliber of the athlete, and how much they perhaps kind of trained their gut to handle carbohydrate. But anywhere between 30 on the low end. Not that smaller amounts wouldn't be beneficial, but it's more clearly ergogenic as you get above that 30 gram sort of threshold. Going up to 90 for many athletes who are kind of middle to higher caliber. And then there is, this debate about going above 90, going above 100. Is there added value to that? I think anecdotally there is. From a scientific perspective, there's no clear evidence that it is at this stage. But from an anecdotal perspective and from what athletes will report in terms of their either performance or recovery, there's an argument, I think, to be made in certain cases to go above that 90 grams an hour, but not necessarily for everybody. There are situations, I think, where it's more likely to have a benefit than others. And it's not going to be every situation that above 90 grams an hour is going to make sense.
Based on the research and based on science that we know today, what do you think is the upper limit that has shown evidence to aid in performance?
Yeah, there's a few studies that have looked at strictly dose response relationships. One kind of looked at anywhere from 0 grams all the way up to, I think it was 120. And they kind of dosed it, I think, in 10 gram increments. In that particular study, which was, I think, a couple of hours of cycling exercise, they found, roughly around 75 to 80 grams an hour was sort of the optimal point. It was the title of the paper is something along the lines of a curvilinear relationship between carbohydrate ingestion and performance, meaning you get better the higher you go, but then at some point you plateau. And even going beyond that, there's a potential risk of negative effects on performance. So there's that study that supports the idea that there is a good dose response relationship up to a certain point. But once you get to, at least in that study, above 80 grams, there's not really a clear benefit on top of that. There's another study that went sort of 30, 60, 90 roughly in those dosages and saw kind of pretty clear improvements from the 30 to 60 to 90, again, cycling endurance exercise.
Sorry, just to clarify. So between 30 to 60, there was an improvement. And between 60 to 90, there was an improvement. Was that what you meant?
Correct. In that case,
Okay.
there was sort of a continued improvement going from 30 to 60, 60 to 90. They didn't go any higher than 90-ish grams in that study, but they did show a dose-response relationship. So there's not really beyond that. There's a couple of studies that have gone beyond 100 grams and compared it to like the 60 to 90 range, and they haven't found additional benefits going above that kind of maybe 90 to 100 gram amount. So the idea that there's clear scientific evidence that 110, 120 grams an hour or above that is going to be better than, let's say, 60 to 90 just isn't shown clearly in the data right now. It doesn't mean it isn't better for some athletes. There's a lot of difficulties scientifically with teasing that out. Part of it is the types of situations where that higher amount is going to be a benefit are really hard to do in a lab scenario and get people to do a full exhaustive effort for multiple hours and do that multiple times. There's a reason why there's not a lot of studies, on really prolonged exercise at a high intensity. Is it's difficult to recover from and difficult to ask people to do multiple times within a few month period. So yeah, it's a challenge.
Yeah. Well, there's definitely this huge narrative about athletes going above 120, right? Do you think that there's a possibility that the high carbohydrate intake has less to do with fueling the muscle, but rather stimulating the brain like a legal performance enhancement drug, where the carbohydrate blunts the perception of fatigue?
Yeah, there's a paper I had published just several months ago on kind of the high carbohydrate ingestion strategy. And part of the discussion in that paper was beyond the actual metabolic benefits of carbohydrate, meaning like the actual energy you get from it when you oxidize carbohydrate. It's possible that some of the benefit is from more central brain mediated mechanisms in terms of, you put something sweet and carbohydrate rich into your mouth when you're fatigued. That is a situation where it is possible you could have some transient short-term performance benefits through more of the kind of the oral stimulation that comes from ingesting something that is sweet and it has carbohydrate in it. Now, does that work at the end of, let's say, a 4 or 5 hour cycling race? Nah, I don't know. I mean, the studies that have looked at carbohydrate mouth rinsing as like a performance strategy, they're all kind of mostly in the 30 to 75 minute range where they're showing benefits. Okay. There's a handful of that have kind of tried doing carbohydrate mouth rinsing under glycogen depleted states or under conditions of longer term exercise, but they're pretty few and far between, and they're not overly, convincing that that's the main mechanism. But it's plausible that could be playing a role. I think it's also plausible that given how much favorable attention that strategy is kind of garnered in the public or in the athletic sphere, there's a chance of a placebo effect there where, if you're ingesting 120 grams of carbohydrate per hour, that also probably means you're feeding more often and you're actually, ingesting gels and beverages more often. And it's from other areas of research, we know that like multiple pills are more powerful than one pill, larger pills are more powerful than smaller pills. So there's a possibility here that, and I don't think this is the main mechanism, but there is some chance that there's a placebo effect going on as well in some limited circumstances. I think that's difficult to prove, but is a possibility that it's not all due to the actual delivery of carbohydrate to the skeletal muscle itself and to the brain itself.
Yeah, I thought so, because there's only a certain amount of carbohydrates that a human body can oxidize per hour, regardless of intensity, right? There's a limit to that. And I believe it's way less than 90 grams per hour, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, well, it kind of depends. I mean, once you get up and you ingest in the like 120 to 150 gram range per hour, and if you're taking that in from, kind of an relatively equal mix of glucose and fructose, you can push pretty high in terms of the oxidation numbers. I don't remember the exact limit off the top of my head, but you can get higher amounts of oxidation going from 90 grams of ingestion to 120 grams of ingestion. The actual amount oxidized at the end, I don't remember. It's the efficiency somewhere like in the 75 to 80% range.
Of the consumption rate, right?
Yeah.
There's a paradox that when you push carbohydrates intake really high to a certain threshold, the body actually starts burning through its own glycogen stores a bit faster. Is the mechanism true?
So there's a couple of studies that looked at, again, kind of this high carbohydrate feeding, going 100 grams per hour or more. And a couple of them suggested sort of evidence that muscle glycogen levels were being sort of utilized a little bit more rapidly in the highest dose carbohydrate conditions. Why that would be, if we assume that's true and it's limited data and the effect sizes or how big the differences were not all that large. So there's a practical question of, does it really matter, or is it more just kind of a, interesting physiological, finding in a couple of studies. But if we assume that's true, it seems like, yeah, as you dose up carbohydrate, you do see, for example, insulin levels go higher during exercise. And insulin is one of those things that is going to mediate whether you're burning more carbohydrate and fats. If insulin levels get so high that you're really forced to burn carbohydrate because fat oxidation has been suppressed so much, you can certainly utilize the ingested carbohydrate, but at some point, it might be kind of forcing your body not only to use a lot of that ingested carbohydrate, but even some of your additional carbohydrate stores in terms of glycogen. Now, whether that's a bad thing or not, I think that's still unsettled at this point. A small increase in muscle glycogen use, is that really going to be a negative thing? I mean, theoretically, it could quicken how fast you run out of that glycogen. But if you're also ingesting a lot more exogenous or carbohydrate from drinks and gels, does that kind of balance that out anyways? I think it's a lot to be
right.
Yeah. There's a lot to be there's a lot of unknowns about that at this stage in terms of, are there any performance implications? But there's at least a couple of studies that do sort of suggest that if you're going real high with the carbohydrate, it can perhaps quicken how much endogenous or stored carbohydrate you're using later on in exercise.
And I guess in response to that, also your fat oxidation rates are going to be turned down if your glycogen.
Correct.
Oh, okay. What are the risks of that? So, if an athlete is applying very high carbohydrate intakes in every training session, across every meal, across weeks and months, what happens to their fat oxidation capacity and their long-term metabolic health? We're not talking about elites here. I'm just talking about the recreational run.
Yeah, it's a good question. There's some studies that certainly have looked at, if you intentionally train occasionally with low carbohydrate stores, you can see some favorable metabolic enzymatic adaptations that turn on more of the fat burning process. And in some cases that leads also to more body fat loss or weight loss. And whether that's actually due to the fat burning or just reduced caloric consumption is a separate issue. But there's short-term studies, a few weeks long, where we do pretty consistently see that if you're training either fasted or with low carbohydrate availability, you are upregulating or increasing your body's ability to utilize fat to a degree. Now, those studies are short. They're a few weeks long. And there's the other sort of argument that you could do that, but what you're going to potentially run into in the end is limited ability to train at high volumes and intense volumes if you're regularly kind of restricting carbohydrates. So sure, over a course of a few weeks, you can kind of, improve your fat oxidation and maybe improve some of your metabolic and enzymatic sort of processes in the muscle that help you burn fat. But in the long run, that can make it difficult to kind of adhere to especially rigorous, intense training programs. So I think the more common argument I hear nowadays is that, especially in the professional realms, is if you're ingesting more carbohydrates, not only necessarily just during exercise, but even before, that's helpful for getting through training sessions, especially the harder ones. And in the long run, if you're better carbohydrate fed, you're going to be able to sustain training better, get sick less often. And in the long run, that adds up to more adaptation, which ultimately feeds into burning more fat in the long run. Those are two different theories that are very difficult to pit against one another because of just, right? Scientifically, it would be almost impossible to design a study that pits those theories against one another. I think for the more recreational athlete, there is a risk of doing too much carbohydrate. If you're already, your body composition is maybe something you're trying to reduce fat to a degree. Maybe you're trying to lose a little bit of weight because you think it would be helpful for your performance or your metabolic health. over ingesting carbohydrate can certainly, I think, in some limited circumstances be a negative for metabolic health, especially for your more recreational athletes, older athletes, which I'd be a little bit more cautious about doing this, 100 grams an hour of carbohydrate for somebody who's not really burning as much energy on a daily basis as a professional level marathoner, ultra runner, cyclist. So and it could be that if you are over ingesting carbohydrate often, it is suppressing your ability to burn fat. Whether that's problematic or not depends a lot on the types of events and competitions you're engaging in. The longer it is, maybe the more detrimental that's going to be. If you're doing 5Ks, then, that's kind of your main focus. I don't think it's as big of a problem. But if you're doing, an ultra marathon or you're an Ironman athlete, then that maybe is more problematic because you're more dependent on carbohydrate to perform. And, if you're not able to really, for whatever reason, get in enough carbohydrate late in your race, it could be more problematic for you as compared to somebody who's a bit more fat adapted.
On the fasted training and the high fat, low carb side of things, what are the risks of that strategy, apart from not being able to accomplish your training goals?
For athletes, I think the risks are potentially a higher risk of injury or illness because of largely under eating. And it's not necessarily the training session where you're, it's not necessarily just the training session where you're doing it beforehand. I think what happens a lot of times, and I've experienced this, is I'll do some training sessions with low carbohydrate availability or fasted in the morning when I wake up, or I'll eat a little bit of protein, but not carbohydrates. I think what oftentimes happens is when you do that, sure, you then eat carbohydrate after the session, but it's still not as much as you would have consumed in total had you eaten before and during. So it's almost like you're putting yourself behind at the start of the day. And I think if most athletes were then able to compensate after their session and actually eat the same total amount that they would have eaten prior to the session and during, I think they would be in a better state, but it's sometimes difficult to do that unless you're intentional about it. So I think that the risk is for already lean athletes who already are kind of low body fat level, and especially you're doing a lot of volume, you're running into that risk of low energy availability and the red S sort of idea, relative energy deficit in sport, where chronically, if you're under eating, especially over weeks and months, that can add up to a higher risk of injuries, illnesses, and things that are ultimately not going to be good for your adaptation or your performance. So I think that's certainly a risk. Is if you're going to do fasted training, be cognizant about all right, once you're done with that session, the rest of the day, are you getting in enough energy and enough carbohydrate to match your training demands? And you need to probably pay a little bit more attention to what you're doing the rest of the day. If you're going to do that regularly.
Yeah, I've made a mistake myself, fasted training, not consuming enough carbohydrates, not consuming enough food. I kind of put myself into sort of a non-functional overtraining state or overreaching state. So my resting heart rate was elevated for weeks. My HRV was depressed downregulated for weeks. And I couldn't figure out what was going on with me. And I went to calculate my calories and how much I was training in relation to my daily consumption. And I realized that I was kind of at the borderline for red S. It took me about 6 weeks to bounce back. So that's the reason why I ask you what your thoughts are on the risk, because I've experienced it and it sucks.
Yeah, it's sometimes deceptive how, you think you're eating enough carbohydrates, but then when you actually measure it and, make an attempt to quantify, even I am sometimes surprised by the amount that I'm eating relative to what I thought I was, and I'm not advocating that people need to track what they're eating every single day all the time. There's some downsides of doing that too. But if you are going to be doing fasted training regularly, I think at least being cognizant of the amount of carbohydrates you're consuming the rest of the day and making sure you're trying to balance out the inputs and outputs as kind of much as you can within reason.
For a recreational runner without any lab access, they have no practical way of estimating their own oxidation rates. So how would they build a fueling optimization strategy that works around their body that actually works for them?
Yeah. I think, it's an interesting area where there's a lot of art to it and a lot of different opinions on how you figure out what to recommend for carbohydrate ingestion strategies. There's as simple as, you kind of start with that 30 to 90 gram range and you play around with it in training, see how well you respond, how well your gut tolerates it, and use that as a base. That's about as simple as you can make it. More sophisticated would be trying to account for the fact that, let's say I'm a bigger athlete or a taller, heavier, or my work output is higher because I'm a higher caliber athlete, let's say. There's suggestions in a few studies, they've actually quantified this, that there are some correlations between body size, meaning height, body mass, power output, and the ability to oxidize what you ingest for carbohydrate. The suggestion being the bigger you are, the more power you can produce. Probably the more exogenous or external carbohydrate that you ingest, you can actually burn and utilize. It could be something to do with absorption, right? A bigger person has a bigger, gut. It could be, more muscle mass, more demand. Exactly why these correlations exist, we don't know for sure, but they do seem to be, at least in limited data we have right now, something that predicts to some degree how much carbohydrate you can ingest. So what I've done in the past is, if you don't have access to a lab, you can still get a reasonable estimate of your oxygen consumption at a given, let's say, running speed or a cycling power output. There's equations out there. There's calculators. You can usually know, an experienced runner or cyclist is going to know what their pace is for a given race. Like when I've done a marathon, I have an idea about what I'm going to run. You can put that speed into a calculator and you can get an estimate of your oxygen consumption. And from that, you can get an estimate of your carbohydrate oxidation total. That's a mix of both inside and outside of your body from what you ingest. But you can at least have an idea about, how much carbohydrate grams per minute am I likely to be burning through during this race. And, for someone my size during a marathon, probably 3 to 4 grams a minute or something like that at the pace that I run a marathon at. I can maybe assume that maybe half of that is going to come from my stored carbohydrate and the other half, maybe the goal is to get it from what I'm ingesting. That's a lot of work to figure all that out. Is it worth it in the end to figure that out? I'm skeptical personally that trying to dial it in that much, sure, you can match the inputs to maybe what you're expending, but does that then lead to better performance? And I think that's a separate issue. We don't know whether dialing in, exactly your optimal oxidation rates then translates to better performance. Because there are companies that are advertising, they can test your personal oxidation rate of even what you ingest by using isotopes.
Okay.
It's a cool idea. I'm not knocking these companies, but it's whether that then leads to better performance. I'm a little bit skeptical of that, to be honest, but we'll see whether there's more scientific data that validates that moving forward, that kind of personalized approach.
Does it make sense to be on the safe side during a race and increase your carbohydrate intake by a little bit?
Yeah, I think, that's a good question. It's like, what are the risks of underdoing it versus overdoing it? And I think the risks of underdoing it are probably worse than slightly overdoing it. So I think as long as you are able to ingest a relatively higher amount with gastrointestinal comfort that doesn't then impact your performance, I don't think there's a whole lot of downside to, going a little bit on the higher end, as long as you can tolerate that and then avoid any gastrointestinal gut issues that are going to negatively impact your performance. So playing around with it in training, when I ran my last marathon, I think I probably was in the 60 to 90 gram per hour range for intake. And, could I have gone higher? Sure. I think I probably could have gone a little bit higher, but it's one of those things that every person needs to, I think, kind of play around with it in training and figure out what seems to work best for them. You can certainly pay to have some expensive testing done if you really want to know, sort of under a given set of controlled circumstances, what you burn relative to what you ingest. But again, I don't know that actually leads to better performance.
Okay. So gut training. Well, I took a look at most of the major the sports brands making gels and sports drinks, and most of the concentration range between 50% to about 80% as in the concentration of carbohydrates in the fluid of the gels, right? So even on the low end, these gels are pretty hypertonic, which means that their osmolality is way above that of blood, right? And as we know, the downstream effects of that is GI distress, which can manifest in a whole plethora of ways that we don't have to go into. But athletes can tolerate it. And I guess most of this ability comes down to proper gut training. So is gut training effectiveness proven by science, or is it a bit of a placebo effect?
Yeah, that's a good question. I want to hop back to the gel osmolality thing real quick before we move on to the gut training part, because a lot of the issues around osmolality of supplements and beverages, I think historically came from older studies that used beverages, right? And you're feeding, let's say, a high osmolality beverage versus a isotonic or lower osmolality beverage. And they were usually giving a pretty large volume of those beverages. I think what happens when you ultimately take a gel, right, is you're drinking a fair amount of water with it. That's going to dilute it anyways. So unless you're taking, gels on their own, without ingesting a sufficient amount of water on top of it, I think I personally wouldn't worry about like the osmolality of a gel. So companies that are marketing, they've got an isotonic gel. The reason why it's isotonic is because there's less carbohydrate in it, and it's got maltodextrin. So it's almost like a marketing kind of gimmick. Like we've got an isotonic gel, but it to get the same amount of carbohydrate as a more hypertonic gel, you'd have to just eat more of that isotonic gel. Because, right, like part of it's the amount of carbohydrate they're putting into each packet. So personally, I would just ignore the actual osmolality issue around gels and just think, what are the sources of sugar I want? How much carbohydrate do I want? And then think about your fluid intake separate from that. And I think that's an easier approach for most athletes than to think about osmolality, and because ultimately carbohydrate quantity and structure is going to be highly correlated with osmolality. So I think if you think more about source of carbohydrate, quantity of carbohydrate, it's a little bit, I think, just easier to think through that part of it. So with that said, the gut training issue, there are not a lot of studies on gut training, to be honest, in terms of showing what exactly the effects are. There's the Good Systematic Review that was published a couple of years ago. I think there were maybe a half a dozen studies or so that have looked at gut training in some shape or form with exercise. What seems to be most clear from the studies is that perceptually there's a benefit, meaning people tend to feel more comfortable with things in their stomach, whether it's carbohydrate or fluid, after they've been habituated to it for at least 5 days or so. They report feeling less, maybe full or bloated. Do you actually get physiological adaptations on top of that? That's less clear at this stage in terms of the studies that have been done. The one that seems like it is maybe more likely is reductions in carbohydrate malabsorption, meaning maybe you're more efficiently absorbing what you're eating. Because there's a couple of studies that have suggested after gut training with high amounts of carbohydrate, the efficiency of absorption seems to be a bit higher, although that was measured indirectly. But the biggest benefit seems to be perceptual. A lot of the physiological benefits that we talk about are based on mostly animal studies and non-exercise human studies. So, they were done at rest in non-athletes for different reasons. So actual studies done in athletes during exercise and gut training, there's a pretty small amount. And the most clear benefit, at least scientifically, seems to be better tolerance. Whether those physiological adaptations on top of that is a little bit more complicated and uncertain.
What's your hypothesis?
Yeah, I think it's probably a combination of both things happening. I think initially, and for most people, it is improved tolerance. You get more used to having that stretched stomach feeling while you're running or while you're cycling. And you're better able to kind of deal with that and not feel it as much, which clearly that could be of benefit. If you're trying to get in a lot of carbohydrate or food and you don't feel like you're as full or bloated, that certainly could be helpful for performance and being able to continue to eat at a relatively high rate if that's your objective during exercise. I also think that at the stomach level, there's good studies with humans at rest where if you feed them a high glucose beverage or even a high fructose beverage, the stomach does adapt over several days to empty that beverage more quickly than it did at the start before you really regularly ingested that fluid for several days in a row. So I think that's plausible. There's also some improvements in how fast some of these sugars and carbohydrates are being emptied from the stomach. And then the absorptive piece, maybe. There's animal studies that suggest a high carbohydrate diet. You get more of the transporters that shuttle the sugars. Yeah.
Like the SGLT1 and the GLUT1, the GLUT5 transporters get upregulated, so it gets transported out your gut faster?
Correct. That's the hypothesis. There's multiple animal studies that have shown, at least from going from a low carb to a high carb diet, you get an upregulation of SGLT1, for example, which is the glucose transporter. One human study now published in the last couple of years also showed that in a low carb to a higher carbohydrate diet. So not like, you know, supplementing during exercise, but at least in principle, it makes sense, right? Now, the fructose transporter in humans really hasn't been explored in terms of gut training and whether that's upregulated, but that certainly is plausible based on other evidence. So those are difficult because you basically have to do intestinal biopsies. So,
that's going to be fun.
Yeah. Gastric emptying you can do through, either tracers or you can, stick a tube through somebody's mouth or nose and sample what's in the stomach. That's still difficult, but reasonable. But to do, intestinal biopsies, you have to put people under and there's more risk. And so there's a reason why there's not a lot of human evidence there. But it's plausible that is an adaptation.
Okay. How quickly can gut training meaningfully occur?
Yeah, there's one study that looked at fluid ingestion. They kind of repeatedly exposed people to higher amounts of fluid across several days, and you saw improvements in tolerance even after a few days. So this would be like 60 to 90 minutes of running or cycling, and you're ingesting more fluid, substantially more fluid than you're used to. Probably close to your sweat rate. After 4 or 5 days, you get improvements in tolerance. Although in that study, they didn't see any faster emptying from the stomach of the actual beverage. It just was tolerance. You got more accustomed to it. The studies that have been done with athletes in specifically carbohydrate gut training have mostly come out of Australia. They did, for those studies, typically 2 weeks, 5 days a week. So they kind of did 10 total days across 2 weeks. So probably anywhere from 5 to 10 days is my guess is kind of in there is where you're really starting to get maybe noticeable, improvements in. Yeah.
Does it last, or is it one of those things that if you stop training your gut, it will reverse back to baseline?
I assume it goes back mostly to baseline. I think unlike, muscular adaptations with training, those are a little bit easier there's sort of a muscle memory there, right? When you detrain, even after a few weeks, but if you've been training for years and years and years, you get back to where you were a little bit more quickly. Would that happen with the gut? I don't know. I'm a little bit more skeptical of that. I think it's probably a bit more acute. It comes, relatively quickly to get the adaptations, and then probably also goes away pretty quickly if you're not maintaining those. Is my guess, but that's really not based on data because there's not really a solid scientific answer to the long-term adaptation to a lot of these things.
Is there a gut training protocol that you would recommend for someone that wants to improve their tolerance for a race?
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on how far out the race is. So you could take a more gradual approach where, if it's, going to be 3 months out and you want to kind of build your way up slowly, every maybe few sessions or your longer sessions, kind of gradually building up, 10 grams per week, for example, you could kind of increase the amount. If you're starting at, let's say, 50 and you want to build your way up to 90 or 100, you're maybe increasing that by 5 to 10 grams a week. So by the time you get a few weeks out of the race, you're kind of at where your target is. Some people will go even higher than that just to know that they can handle even a bit more and then back off as they get closer to the race.
Okay.
Just with the knowledge that the race is going to be an extra demand on your body that you're not able to always replicate in training. So if you can,
Yeah.
tolerate
Like a
100
safety
grams in
net.
training and you're trying to hit 80 or 85 during the race, you should be pretty comfortable, even if, you're under a little bit more physiological stress during the race itself. If it's less time than that, then yeah, you'd have to kind of devote, probably at least 5 sessions, I would say, over a short amount of time, kind of getting your gut accustomed to that. You could do it, but it wouldn't probably be particularly pleasant. And,
Yeah.
you're also having to focus a lot of your time on, ingesting a lot of carbohydrate during your training sessions, which isn't always going to be conducive to your other goals associated with those training sessions. So my personal approach would be to spread it over at least a couple of months. Whereas the scientific studies are doing it in 10 days because you kind of really just have to do it quickly, get people through the study so you don't get dropouts. And it's just a more controlled setting. But that's not the way I would probably do it in reality for most people. I would probably spread it over, at least a month, upwards of kind of the 1 to 3 month range, depending on how much time you have.
Like the final block of your training is when you really should build it in, I guess.
Yeah, that's personally when I've done it or how I've done it and how I would recommend it to most athletes. But yeah, I mean, it really depends on the person and what the event is and how much time they have to prepare and how they're prioritizing other training objectives versus, getting ready in terms of the carbohydrate ingestion part of it.
The point you made about training your body to be able to consume a bit more than what you actually need makes a lot of sense, because apart from the stress of the race itself, there is also the element of heat, right? If the race turns out to be hotter than what you expect it to be, would that actually affect the amount of tolerance you can endure with your carbohydrate intake?
Yeah, it can certainly affect tolerance. I mean, when you've got especially if you're not accustomed to the heat, it's another story if you've spent a lot of time and devoted sessions to heat training and you feel like you're well prepared, then it shouldn't have as much of an impact, especially if you've also been ingesting carbohydrate regularly during some of those heat training sessions. But if it's sort of unexpected heat or you're not ready for it, what that means is there's going to be more blood flow sent to your skin and your periphery to cool you off. And that generally means less blood flow to your gut, which tends to cause not only symptoms like, nausea, cramping, pretty much any symptom tends to get worse with dehydration and heat. But it also functionally can change maybe how well your gut is coordinated in terms of its motility, right? Kind of the muscular contractions, how well it absorbs things. Because with heat stress and dehydration, you can kind of get a bit of a leaky gut sort of situation where, there's things that start to pass into your bloodstream that typically don't when you're not under those conditions. Absorption may become an issue, right? Because it's just the overall function of your gut wall declines when it's getting less oxygen and less nutrients itself. I mean, it's active tissue. It needs its own energy. It needs oxygen to function well. And if you're under heat stress and you're trying to maintain a high output in terms of your work output, there's only so much blood to go around. So it's going to ultimately have an impact on tolerance and your ability to handle maybe what you thought you were going to be able to ingest because of it.
Let's talk a bit about sodium bicarbonate. That seems to be a very evidence-backed ergogenic supplement in sport, but it has massive GI side effects. What is it actually doing physiologically, and how does it improve performance?
So it's one of these supplements that honestly has been around since the 70s or 80s. I mean, there are even studies going back to like the 1930s that were playing around with it, not necessarily with the objective of clearly improving, sport performance. But of the supplements out there, I mean, it's one of them that's been around a long time because it was initially used to study, okay, we want to understand what's the effect of acidosis and alkalosis on human performance. They would use sodium bicarb as the substance to create more of an alkalosis environment, whereas they would use other substances to create more of an acidic environment. And that's part of how we know that, for example, pH level of the bloodstream and the muscle is going to be something that impacts performance. If you think in your muscle, particularly during high intensity exercise, you're producing lactate and probably more importantly, hydrogen ions, which kind of create an acidic environment. Your body makes an attempt to kind of buffer those acids, and it's equipped to do it in certain ways. And one of the ways it can do that is through bicarbonate in the blood. What it's thought to do, one of the mechanisms at least, is it kind of creates maybe a bigger, let's say, gradient for those hydrogen ions to go from the highly acidic environment of the muscle when you're really working hard to the bloodstream. So maybe more rapid transfer of those hydrogen ions from the muscle to the bloodstream, which allows the muscle to stay in a little bit more of a favorable pH state to be able to function appropriately, right? So that's the idea, is you're increasing the bicarbonate pool in the bloodstream, which allows the body to maybe deal with especially high intensity exercise where production of lactate and hydrogen ions is more clearly an issue for limiting performance. So traditionally we would think, especially less than 10 minutes. So think like, 1 minute to 10 minutes is kind of the typical range where sodium bicarb has been recommended as a supplement, because that's generally when you produce the highest amounts of, like lactate and hydrogen ions in the short term in terms of a concentration. So you would ingest baking soda, the kind of over the counter, buy it for $1 at the grocery store, and that gives you probably hundreds of servings in that one box. So one of the cheapest supplements you could possibly use. However, has historically not been used in the real world very much at all, because, as you mentioned, the gastrointestinal problems that comes along with it. The analogy that usually I'll give is back in elementary school, if you did the experiment where you take vinegar and mix it with baking soda, you're like making a volcano in class, right?
Yeah.
If you think about that happening in your stomach, it's not going to be pleasant, because the amounts of bicarb that you need to ingest, typically for most people, are in like the 15 to 30 gram range, depending on how big your body size is. So in the let's say middle of that 20, 25 grams, that's a lot of baking soda. I mean, just at home, put that amount of baking soda in a glass and put some vinegar in it and see what happens, right?
Yeah.
So your stomach is an acidic environment. When that baking soda interacts with the acid in your stomach, it creates a lot of CO2 production, fullness, bloating, nausea, vomiting in some cases. That's the top half. When that bicarbonate and in the sodium load, because there's a lot of sodium you're getting with that, 20 grams of baking soda, that's probably, I want to say it's about 6 grams or 7 grams of sodium, twice the amount that someone's supposed to get in a day.
Yeah.
Once it gets into your intestines, that's going to cause water to be pulled out into your intestines, because it's a huge difference, right, in the kind of the osmolalities there that your body's trying to equalize. And that's when you get kind of the loose, stools, diarrhea, urges to have to use the bathroom. So clearly none of that stuff is going to be good for performance. So it's always been this balance of, can I take enough to get the benefit without getting all the side effects, has been the issue. And there are some potential ways to mitigate those side effects. And that's why I think it's becoming more popular, is because there's more knowledge and products even out there that may help with some of those side effects.
I've done exactly that. The first time I heard about it, I took 0.3 grams per kilogram of my body weight. So it ended up about 20 grams of sodium bicarbonate, mixed it with some water, knocked it down, went out for a run. And within 30 minutes, I was running straight back to the toilet. And it wasn't pleasant.
No, I mean, to be honest, like if you're one of those people that has trouble going to the bathroom before a race, then
that's a perfect laxative.
A lower dose it's a bit of a laxative. So, I mean, I guess from that perspective, if it doesn't bother you, then maybe that's helpful in regard. But for most athletes, they don't want to be dealing with that. Because usually that stuff will typically happen 30 to 90 minutes after you ingest it, kind of depending on the person, the dosage and other factors. You kind of have that like hour and a half period where you're sort of uncertain about whether you're going to be good to go.
Well, then I tried the hydrogel-based bicarb that Morton was offered, and I had no GI issues at all. But that caused an arm and a leg. So if someone wants to use the kitchen pantry sodium bicarbonate, so would you suggest they take it 2 hours before a race, spend some time in the toilet, and ride it out? Or
that's a possibility. I wouldn't recommend that approach, but it is a possibility. It's interesting. There's a student in my lab right now who part of his dissertation is doing a systematic review on gastrointestinal symptoms from sodium bicarb supplementation. The paper is under review and being revised, so hopefully it gets accepted here in the next month or so. But yeah, we found ultimately, I think it was 101 studies that had quantified gastrointestinal symptoms along with sodium bicarb supplementation. And from that review, it seems like the strategies that have some evidence are going to be spreading the dose out. So whether it's capsules or a beverage, instead of taking, let's say 10 minutes or 15 minutes, spread that out over, an hour to, there's some studies going up to, more than 10 hours. If you're spreading it out that much, you might have to up the dose a little bit.
But what's the half-life?
Yeah, so that's the thing is, the studies that have looked at ingesting it and spreading it out, usually you see increases in bicarb levels in the blood that peak oftentimes starting around, 60 to 90 minutes after ingestion. But if you're spreading it out, it's a little bit of a different curve. But there's enough studies that have done that have shown a performance benefit that I think it's still a reasonable approach to take. I would say you'd want to probably finish your last dose or the last sip or last set of capsules or whatever it is, maybe 60 to 90 minutes before your competition is. When I've done sodium bicarbonate and used it for my own performance, that's the approach I've used recently, is split up the dose. I still get some symptoms, but they haven't been bad. They haven't impacted my performance negatively. I will say if it's like a marathon or something you're using it for where it's a longer event and those types of issues are more problematic or more likely in the first place, I would be a little bit more careful about that, or at least try it out multiple times beforehand. Because when I've used it, the sipping approach or the spreading it out over, let's say, a few hours, I've used it for a 5K, a 5-mile race, running race. So it's like the odds that I'm going to have a huge event in it's 18-minute 5K is minimal. So it has a negative.
You can be done with the 5K and then go to the toilet.
Yeah. Who cares what happens after the 5K? Whatever. I can spend some time in the Porta-John. That's fine. So that's an option. It's very cheap. So I've mixed it with water and then just some flavoring, because otherwise it's going to taste like salt water because of the amount of sodium in there. You could play around with that and see if it works. The other options would be enteric-coated capsules, so capsules that are meant to be resistant to stomach acid. So enteric-coated, right? They kind of have a lining on the capsule that allows them to kind of get into your intestine without that bicarbonate interacting with the acid in your stomach, because your intestine is a more neutral pH, and you're not going to get all that CO2 production. The studies on that, there's a few of them seem to suggest it's pretty good at minimizing symptoms. I've used that before and had mixed results. So I think, again, you'd have to try it out. And the downside would be if you either buy the capsules if you can find them, or you'd have to make the capsules.
That was what I was going to ask. Do you have to encapsulate it yourself?
If you can't find a product that sells them that way, I'm trying to think. I haven't looked recently if there's a company on the market that's selling enteric-coated capsules at this point. It's not that hard to make them, but you may have to fill 20 to 40 capsules depending on what the dose is. So, and that's also having to take 20 to 40 capsules. So if you don't like taking pills, that's not going to be, the route for you. There's also the Morton bicarb product for sure. They've got at least now probably 4 or 5 studies on it. There's only, I think, been one that's actually directly compared it to a traditional sodium bicarbonate strategy, because the other studies they've done have compared it to a non-bicarb placebo, which is a little bit different. But the one they compared against the traditional sodium bicarb, I think, was capsules, not enteric-coated. It pretty clearly reduced the severity of gastrointestinal symptoms. So at a minimum, I think it's likely that it's fairly effective at least minimizing or reducing the symptoms. The obvious downside is it's $17.50 per dose in cost. So, it's probably the most expensive sports supplement on the market or close to it. So not a problem for a professional athlete who's either getting it for free or their team's paying for it or whatever. But for people who don't have that for free or for limited, who have limited availability to get it and don't want to pay for it, it's definitely expensive. So yeah. And the other thing is it's like a pudding sort of mixture. And we've had some people in our lab do not like that texture and will not use it again because of that. So it is a unique consistency. What's your thought on the consistency and the delivery mechanism?
It was fine for me as long as I didn't have any issues. I wasn't so fussy about the texture. I think they have a bit of carbohydrates in there, so it was a bit sweet, which made it a lot more palatable than it was just bland with the sodium bicarbonate pellets that are in there. So the sweetness kind of made it go down a bit better. I mean, it's like, I don't know, it's like sucking on slime. How else do you explain it? It's like, it's not gel.
I guess it's like a pudding gel mixture almost,
in those days where you have like the gel for the hair, it's almost like eating that texture. Yeah. So
yeah.
I mean, it's a bit translucent.
Personally, I mean, I'm fine with it. Besides the cost, I mean, I don't want to pay $18 every time I want to use bicarb. So I've gone with other approaches, but that's not anything against their company and the product. It's a good product. It's just, it's expensive.
It's a very good product. It's just very expensive.
So if you're willing to want to pay for that, great. It's a fantastic option. So what they do is, it's a carbohydrate gel with sort of what they call hydrogel. When it gets into the stomach with the acid, the ingredient sort of turns into a more viscous gel-like substance that's supposed to sort of surround and protect the bicarb tablets that they have from, again, the acidic environment of the stomach is the idea. And it seems to, work pretty well at reducing symptoms. So it's definitely a viable option. I think the other thing is if you're going to use it during exercise, which for any endurance athletes or a cyclist, for example, that is actually a way to use it because those events are so long. The Morton bicarb product is a little bit difficult to implement. Let's say you're on a bike in the middle of, a monument race. Are you going to, eat out of a bowl, the gel-like pudding stuff? I don't know. I mean, there is I think a clip of Michael Woods from maybe World Championship a couple of years ago, actually eating out of a container the hydrogel during a race. But I think, not super practical if you're going to use it that way, which is a possibility, is to use it ingested in smaller amounts, spread throughout a longer event, as opposed to the shorter anaerobic events that we think it works maybe best for.
So it does work for longer events. Is that what you're saying?
Uncertain. I think the one study that is done, I think that's maybe most applicable to a real world environment. They had higher level cyclists where they spread out the dose. I think it was before and during, where maybe it totaled up to about 0.3 grams per kilogram. Spread it over several hours of before and during exercise. And then they looked at the end of this several hour bike ride, 90-second all-out effort, which mimics what happens in a real cycling race, right? I mean, if think of the end of the Tour de France this last year, Wout van Aert dropping Pogacar at the end there. It's basically a 90-second effort on Montmartre in Paris. So I would show that to my class and say, sure, bicarb isn't studied as much for something like that, but that's a scenario how in that sport it actually does kind of make some sense, because dropping somebody, on a climb is a big part of how you would win a race, or outsprinting somebody at the end of a cycling race is often the way those events are decided. Contrast against like an ultra race, running, I mean,
a marathon where it's just constant all the way, right?
Yeah. I mean, certainly you see the highlight clips of the runners kicking against each other at the end. And I guess in that scenario, it helps. But it's less frequent that I think tactics like that ultimately are as deciding, or the end kick is not as big of a deal in marathoning, or especially ultra running. I mean, rarely are you going to see it come down to a kick at the end.
Exactly.
Now, it doesn't mean it doesn't work for those events. It's just way understudied because, we kind of thought, right, hydrogen ions and anaerobic exercise, this is what it's for. And now more and more people are using it. And I see elite marathoners all the time, on their Instagram or whatever, ingesting bicarb before the races. Does it help? Maybe it does, but there's not a lot of data that has had exercise go beyond an hour and looked at bicarb and what it does. So I'm sure there's going to be more studies on that in the next few years, and we'll have a better answer. But right now, we don't know.
Okay. Well, let's move on to caffeine. Well, that's like the most widely used ergogenic substance in sport, right? So most of the times you either take it in a tablet form that you swallow or in caffeinated sports gels. These delivery methods usually take about 45 to 60 minutes for it to peak in your body. What are your thoughts about ingesting caffeine sublingually, which is under the thumb rather than...
More and more interest in that route, whether it's sort of like a dissolvable strip or gum. Gum has probably been the one that I think that's been the most studied in kind of an oral delivery approach. So the idea is like you chew caffeinated gum for maybe 10, 15 minutes. It probably takes that amount of time for the caffeine to get out of the gum to actually be absorbed. And sort of, it's more buccal absorption in your mouth versus in your stomach, or it would really be more in your intestines where downstream it's going to happen. So the idea is it's, holding that caffeine in the mouth for longer facilitates that buccal absorption and would therefore get it into your bloodstream a bit quicker than if you were to actually quickly ingest it in and swallow it. It's going to have to go through your stomach and then into your intestines to be largely absorbed. So as you mentioned, it may be higher or quicker peak of caffeine in the bloodstream if you chew gum or take a dissolvable strip or something like that. As compared to oral ingestion. How big the difference is in timing? There's not a lot of studies that have looked at that, honestly. So I think the message would be like, if for some reason there's a priority for you to get caffeine into your bloodstream a bit quicker, chewing gum, caffeinated gum could be an option. If for some reason you want it to be in your bloodstream, peaking at 15 to 30 minutes versus 45 to 60 for whatever reason. So that is a possibility. It's a legitimate approach to taking caffeine. I will say generally, the studies on performance, the vast majority of them, especially in endurance performance, have been done with oral ingestion. So personally, I would kind of go with the tried and true route and not worry so much about the dynamics of peak caffeine in the bloodstream, because there's even debate about, does the performance benefit coincide with peak blood levels? And there's not clarity that that's actually the case. So it's not to diminish gum or those other options as a possible strategy, but I personally wouldn't worry too much about like the timing of peak caffeine levels in the blood and trying to match it to when I'm going to perform. I would go off of what your own personal experience is, how you feel like you best respond to caffeine in terms of ingesting it beforehand, what the timing is.
Are there GI issues related to caffeine intake?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially at high dosages. I mean, the higher the dose you go.
I was thinking of that a bit more through the lens of bypassing the GI. And if you take it sublingually, it would probably bypass that whole gastrointestinal tract, right? Yeah,
I think it's possible that the symptoms could be less, and there's a few reasons why that could be. So one possibility is, let's say you are delivering 200 milligrams of caffeine via gum versus a tablet or a drink. Now, you can chew that gum for 10 minutes, but it may not be that 100% of that caffeine actually gets absorbed, because there's still some maybe left in the gum. So it could be partly that you just get less caffeine when you, let's say, chew gum, because you're not getting the full absorption. The other thing is it is bypassing the liver when you kind of absorb it, in the mouth versus when it's in the intestine, kind of gets first passed to the liver. So there might be some differences in kind of the rate of metabolism and how it's metabolized. The other thing is, there's likely sensory tissue in your intestines, in your stomach, that respond to caffeine directly, that could be causing some more direct effects when that caffeine, when you swallow it, goes into your, stomach, your intestines. That's actually sort of activating sensory tissue in your gut itself that may not happen when you chew it. So I've only really seen one study directly quantify gastrointestinal side effects from gum versus oral, and there was a slight reduction in symptoms with the gum route. but it wasn't like it was a big study. Sample size was pretty small. So I think it's plausible that side effects could be less, but I don't think it's conclusive at this point.
What about caffeine mouth rinsing? I think you did some studies on this, did you?
I had a PhD student who did a systematic review on that several years ago, and yeah, I can't remember at the time how many studies there were. There might have been a dozen or two, and it was mixed findings in terms of
Okay.
performance benefit. And that's a situation where I think more directly you would probably expect there to be fewer gastrointestinal symptoms from
Yeah.
rinsing a carbohydrate, not a carbohydrate beverage, but a caffeine beverage, and then spitting it out because you're not ingesting it. The absorption in the mouth might happen, but if you're only rinsing it for 10 seconds, it's not like it's going to be, you know, anywhere near complete absorption. So if it is working, it's through some sort of sensory sort of effect where it's interacting with either taste receptors. Caffeine's pretty bitter, so there's bitter taste receptors in your mouth that not only caffeine, but other substances have been shown to be activated and then maybe impact brain activation and motor output. So that's a plausible mechanism. And there's probably also, again, my own personal experiences separate from any bitter taste. I mean, I can tell when I ingest something that has caffeine in it versus a decaffeinated version. I mean, I can almost perceptually, it seems like it gives me a bit more oomph in my efforts. Like if I'm running or something like that, it's almost immediate for me, at least, as compared to if it's a decaffeinated drink. I don't notice that extra kind of kick. So there's something sensory going on there that I think under some circumstances could be a benefit. How you apply that, when you apply that best, it's not clear exactly what would be the best application.
Some people get headache when they take coffee or they take caffeine. Maybe that could be an option for someone that doesn't tolerate it well.
Yeah, I think that's a good example of if you frequently get the side effects from oral ingestion, it's worth trying that maybe. Another example might be, let's say it's late in a competition, and cycling could be an example again, because they, during a grand tour, they go every day, and it's 4 p.m. towards the end of a stage, and you don't want to necessarily ingest a ton of caffeine that late in the day. So maybe
you can't sleep.
the rinsing is, the rinsing is at least something we're trying as a way to maybe get some extra power output for a shorter amount of time without actually having to ingest that. And then the downside of the maybe your sleep later on is going to be impacted if you had ingested it. So yeah, I think there's case uses. Fasted training, sometimes it's used. Carbohydrate mouth rinsing, it's the same thing. Similar applications in some regard.
For someone that is accustomed to taking caffeine all the time, whether it's tea or coffee or Coca-Cola, it's always recommended that they would stop caffeine intake 1 or 2 weeks before their primary race, their main race, right? Is there any evidence to support that this strategy actually works? And how long should they be abstaining from caffeine for to actually have a meaningful difference?
Yeah, it's because there were some historical studies that had this suggestion that if you were to reduce caffeine intake for several days, before performance test, and then reintroduce it, you would get a bigger benefit than compared to just having sustained caffeine intake for those several days beforehand. I think in totality, the most recent evidence, which is supported by a meta-analysis and some recent studies, is that it doesn't seem like you really need to abstain in most cases. The exception to that maybe is for high caffeine consumers. There's diminished effects of caffeine if you're regularly consuming it in high amounts across the whole day. So maybe if you are one of those people that do use a lot of caffeine, and that might be something like, in total above 4 or 5 milligrams per kilogram per day. So, that might be more than 300 or 400 milligrams per day for a lot of people. It's not conclusive that it'll be beneficial to slightly reduce your caffeine intake, but there's not a lot of risk to doing it either, I think.
Okay.
I personally wouldn't go and completely abstain, because then you're going to get withdrawal symptoms, and I don't think the evidence suggests you need to do that. For me, I think the biggest issue with a lot of these studies is, clearly caffeine, if you compare it to placebo, it's going to, improve your performance. But the question is, how does it compare to what you just normally do before your typical training? Like, are you normally consuming caffeine? Are you, what's your habitual kind of pre-exercise routine? And I think to some degree that might inform what you might want to do during competition. Because like if you want I want an extra, oomph from this caffeine compared to what I normally get. Well, if you're normally consuming a fair amount before your training, it's just going to be, you're just kind of continuing as is what you normally are going to experience, right? So in some respects, I like to think about it as, what are you typically doing before a lot of your training sessions? And then what are you hoping to get out of the caffeine ingestion with your competition? If you're hoping to get a bit more than what you get from your training, you might need to up the dosage a little bit if you're a regular caffeine consumer before your training. Because clearly, like in the studies, placebo versus caffeine is always going to win for the most part, even among people who are regular users. But that's comparing them against a situation where they're probably not often competing with no caffeine, right? So it's a little bit of a tricky sort of scientific puzzle to untangle. But overall, simplistically, I don't think most people need to go through like a substantial withdrawal of caffeine several days beforehand. Evidence doesn't seem to suggest that that's needed for most people.
We're probably not going to have time to cover everything. But before we land the plane, I just want to ask you about acetaminophen or paracetamol. I don't remember which book it was that I read, or one of Matt Fitzgerald's book, where he talked about the use of acetaminophen. And I've also heard Peter Attia talk about it on his podcast with Ryan Hall. Is there any evidence that it actually that acetaminophen actually can improve endurance performance?
It's very mixed and I would say weak. There's studies that have shown some improvements. They've been generally pretty small improvements, mostly on what we call timed exhaustion tests, which are, you go on a treadmill or a bike, the intensity gets set for you and you decide, or you go as long as you want until you decide you want to quit. So it's a little bit different from like a race where most of the time you're trying to cover a distance as fast as possible, where you can change the pacing up and down as much as you want. Why that's important is among the sort of time trial or race-like conditions, there's not really a clear benefit for most of those among the studies that have been done. So if there is a benefit, what I would say is quite small. I personally, I think not that there's a huge amount of risk to one dose of Tylenol or acetaminophen or paracetamol before certain types of competition, but the benefit to risk ratio to me is not, the benefit isn't big enough for me to invest in it as a worthwhile strategy personally. That being said, there's a handful of studies that have suggestive, evidence of performance benefit. Not big though, quite small.
Well, it seems to be the ultra marathoners that use it more than any other distance in running, right? Could it be that when you go a very long distance, it just helps mitigate the pain more than actually improving the performance?
Yeah, that's completely plausible because most of the studies that have looked at it have been short in terms of the intensity and or the duration of exercise. So, a 40-minute, test in the lab is very different from a 100-mile race in the real world. So, it is possible that under those conditions, it could elicit some more benefits. Like a lot of things in ultra running in that space, there just isn't a lot of good evidence because it's almost impossible to do controlled studies with those durations and intensities because the traditional approach is you bring people into a lab, you have them do a performance test under one condition, you bring them back a few days later, and the test might last, a half an hour to an hour or something. There's some endurance, whether it's the 5K, 10K of running, whatever it is. To do that with an ultra event and actually get a sort of idea about realistic performance, it just isn't plausible. Unfortunately, I don't think we're honestly going to oftentimes have clear evidence around what works and what doesn't work for ultra events because it's not realistic to do those studies and get enough people to have conclusive evidence or high quality evidence that we would bank on. So it's to be honest, it's oftentimes going to be anecdotal experience mixed with some data from other areas that seems positive in experimentation. So I don't want to diminish that there's a possibility that it does help, but yeah, it's challenging to figure out really whether it does in that environment, because it's almost impossible to study those events in a realistic way.
Creatine, do you think that's a good supplement to be included in a runner's toolkit? Aside from the benefits of, the brain benefits and the strength benefits, but as a runner or an endurance athlete?
I think it depends a lot on what distances they're running. I think if it's shorter distances, like a track and field athlete who's doing middle distances, or even like a 5K, my concern would be is with like a marathoner, there is some extra weight gain typically for most people who take creatine, where we're talking about anywhere from 1 to 3 pounds. And that may not necessarily be a problem for some athletes. I think it's always weighing what's the benefit versus the risk. And I think the benefit versus the risk is much better for an athlete where their energy systems are much more closely aligned with the need for phosphocreatine, which is a energy source that you rely on, right? You have repeated efforts, high intensity efforts. So sprinter or even a shorter track athlete who needs to have high bursts of energy, right, to make a move on the track. When you get out to a marathoner, most of that is not being relied on in terms of phosphocreatine. So it just isn't an energy system during the race, at least. That's all that important. And if you've got an extra couple pounds of weight, I don't think the math adds up necessarily for a marathoner. The counter argument, I guess, would be if in training it allows them to do a bit more high intensity work. Theoretically, that translates to better performance. But at the marathon, I don't really buy that. So I think it depends a lot on the nature of the actual event for a runner, especially because its body weight is a part of it. And if you're adding on a couple extra pounds for no reason, it may not always be worth it in terms of performance. So I've played around with creatine before, especially when I'm focusing on things like a mile race or a 5K. The downsides to me are less likely, and it may help me with some of my training. If I'm training for a marathon, I'm not taking creatine. But, it's to each their own. And there probably are some marathoners out there who are using creatine and find it to be helpful for them for whatever reason.
As we land the plane, if you had one final practical takeaway for someone who is looking to improve performance, either through a high carb regime or through supplementation, what would it be?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of interest in supplements, and there definitely are supplements that offer benefits, whether it's caffeine or bicarb or creatine or beta-alanine, things like that, or nitrates. I think those are worth potentially exploring. I would say getting the fundamentals right first is, I think, a big priority, because if you look at what a lot of athletes are doing just day to day, there's a lot of improvements probably that can be made there first, or in conjunction with taking supplements if they want to take supplements. But instead of turning to supplements first right away, or viewing them as the primary thing to focus on, I think the basics around getting enough energy in, getting enough high quality energy in, and eating a diet that maybe is also rich in things like anti-inflammatory and antioxidants that are maybe going to help you recover, stay healthy, don't get sick, while also getting enough energy and carbohydrate to support your training demands. I think spending some time thinking about that and focusing on those things, either in addition to supplementation, or focus on those things first and then see what supplements can offer, is sort of what I would tell most athletes and most of the students that I teach. That's kind of the things we talk about in terms of the basics matter too, and sometimes they're overlooked. There's always new supplements always being marketed, especially nowadays with how many companies that are selling things. They got to find ways to differentiate themselves, and they market products in a way that make them sound groundbreaking when, most of the time it's a 1% benefit at best. So that matters, but it's not as big as what most companies would like you to think it is in most cases.
My closing question for you, Patrick, is what does endurance mean to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, personally for me, I guess it means being able to sustain efforts under conditions that are challenging, whether that be actually during training or exercise, or during your own life, whether it be personally or professionally. I mean, things don't always go your way. Projects don't always go the way you want them to in terms of research project. You have to find ways to, I think, push through that and enjoy the process as much as you can, and learn to like suffering to a degree. I think most endurance athletes can relate to that. Part of it is a little bit of a love-hate relationship with making yourself suffer.
Patrick, thank you.
Yeah, it was a very fun conversation. I really enjoyed talking about a lot of these things because they're definitely, topics that a lot of athletes have interest in and oftentimes have questions about. So I really appreciate the opportunity.